Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSite Network. Our topic of discussion today is the historical consciousness in ancient India. And friends, for this very discussion and lecture, we have with us in our studio Dr. Shankar Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Hindu College, University of Delhi. Friends, Dr. Kumar has been teaching for more than a decade, and with this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Sir to our studio. Thank you, Sir, for coming, and I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Urvashi. Good afternoon, viewers. Today, we shall be talking about something which is existing in history writing almost as a charge on ancient Indian history, and it exists in the form of a kind of a label that ancient Indians did not have historical consciousness. What do we mean by historical consciousness? When this charge was actually labeled against ancient Indian people, and what were the political implications, or in fact the backdrop in which these charges were made, and what is the Indian response to this kind of a charge, this kind of an accusation almost. That is what we shall be talking about today. And let's try and understand that the kind of history with which we are socialized in the present format is something which is not very ancient. So it is quite possible that what is implied by history as a subject is something which is time specific, that it happened during a particular point of time, and it's not a universally valid kind of a definition. It's quite possible, in other words, for other cultures and also other times to have different conceptualization of history. So these are the things through which we shall try to look at this particular issue of the presence or absence of historical consciousness in ancient India. When we say historical consciousness and try to understand as to what is the meaning and content of it, the best way to understand this is through the issue itself, the time and the context in which the charge was labeled against Indian history or Indian people, so to say. That itself will let us know as to how it unpacked itself over a period of time so far as the issue is concerned. Now, the British administrative historians who started writing about Indian past, particularly when they were confronted with the task of administering India, then of course they had to resort to Indian customs, Indian traditions, Indian history, because in the absence of a written constitution or a valid constitution, it was through the awareness and knowledge about Indian past, practices, customs that they could administer over India. They could pass on judgments, they could resolve issues which came to them as administrators and so forth. And in this task, of course, they took the help of the local learned people in the form of Pandits and Maulavis to inform them about some of the scriptures, some of the ancient Indian texts, which could lend some kind of a help to them in knowing and understanding India's past, and thereby helping them out in carrying out the administration. All of us know that a set of alien people who are who are civilizationally different from us, who have language barrier and so forth. So, of course, it entailed quite a few difficulties to begin with at the level of translation, at the level of communication, at the level of understanding some of the basic categories with which we as Indians had been living. So, these were some of the issues, and it is in the last quarter of the 18th century that this started, and all through the 19th century the exercise went on. And when at the instance of the Pandits and Maulavis, the British administrative historians did lay their hands on some of the select scriptures and some of the select texts, the kind of impression that they formed after a cursory reading of these texts is that ancient Indians probably did not care to mention about specific time, or did not care to mention of events, so to say mundane events, everyday life events, worldly events in a chronological fashion, the way contemporary Europeans were doing so far as their histories are concerned, so far as their conceptualization of history is concerned, and we will come to it as to how even this conceptualization, even this Western conceptualization of history as a series of events chronologically bound in a cause and effect relationship and so forth, was also not something which was eternal, was also not something which was existing ever since time immemorial. Rather, it was a post-Renaissance, post-Enlightenment product. So, this chronology bound history premised on facts and evidences and so forth was also a recent thing for them. But these administrative historians who had been entrusted the task of administering over Indian people, over native people, they were socialized to that conceptualization of history, and that is why probably while reading the ancient scriptures, while reading ancient Indian texts, they were actually looking for those specific things which in their conceptualization constituted proper history as a discipline. And all of us know that most of the ancient Indian texts, particularly the pre-Puranic texts, say the Vedas, the Upanishads, Dharma Sutras, Dharma Shastra and so forth, they somehow did not care to inform the readers or the posterity about the actual sequence of events with reference to specific dates in the sense of say year and so forth, or human time, so to say, was not reckoned with in their presentation of their account of past, or their account of whatever happened or whatever was of consequence to us. So, when they read the Vedas, the Upanishads and the Dharma Shastric and Dharma Sutras and so forth literature, the initial impression was that probably people in ancient India did not have some kind of engagement with worldly affairs or mundane affairs, and they rather were outwardly in their, or otherworldly in their orientation. So, it was spirituality, it was metaphysics that they were talking about, it was all abstractions and nothing concrete which was there in these texts, and therefore, as a consequence of this kind of an impression, which of course was partly on account of the fact that they did not have access to the range of sources that are available to us today, but they were only confining their studies to some very specific instructed texts by the Pandits and the Maulavis. And there is politics at play in prescribing these texts to the British administrative historians at the behest of the Pandits and Maulavis also. As a result of all this, this impression gained credence amongst the Europeans, and they made this charge. If we look at the writings towards the end of the 19th century and towards the beginning of this, towards the beginning of 20th century, we do get to see that quite a few caustic remarks were made regarding the ancient Indian lack of historical content in these sources, and very soon it was not confined to the specific sources that they were reading. It actually acquired the form of an impression about ancient India as such. And we know that during around the same period, we have even Karl Marx talking of Asiatic mode of production and changeless India, Oriental despotism, etc. So, these theories are also being propounded, which in fact implied that ancient India was bereft of any change, any historical change, and whatever system existed, it was with a sense of full sufficiency, with a sense of self-sufficiency that people were living, and they were there wasn't much of a structural change in the economy pattern of society, or for that matter even politics and religion so far as their structures are concerned. So, this is how these charges started getting made, or these labels started being given to ancient India, and it was even said that probably ancient Indians did not have historical consciousness. And by historical consciousness, obviously here they meant some kind of a linear sequence of change, or you can say the conceptualization of time with which the British administrative historians were concerned with was a linear conceptualization of time, and not encountering these, they made this charge that probably ancient India was bereft of any historical consciousness. People did not bother about past, or past was of no relevance to the people living in ancient India. Now, having understood the actual charge, let us now try and understand as to why these administrative historians are actually not looking at other sources, or to what extent this kind of presentation of Indian past actually was in sync with their ideological justification that they had been giving for the perpetuation of colonial rule. Now, at one instance what we find is, or at one level what we find is that the people who were initially called upon to help them out in identifying some of the texts and prescribing some of the texts for study by the Europeans, these local learned Pandits and Maulvis, let's remember that the British had come to power by dismantling a ruling elite, which essentially were Islamic people, or they were Muslims. And there were Hindus who, or the Brahmins or the Pandits, who now saw that we have a set of ruling elite which is non-Muslim, and they had their own anxieties to resolve, and they had their own political issues to contend with. And also the fact that on account of being Brahmins, they were also at some kind of a tense relationship with the Kshatriyas and so forth. Had they, suppose, why I am saying this is because had they proposed to the British that they should be reading the Puranas, then perhaps this kind of a charge would not have been made, because in the Puranas we have a very sequential account of royal genealogies. And since it is royal genealogy, of course, the time bracket that is reckoned with in Puranas is human time. So, it is 25 years, 20 years or 30 years. So, it is in that sense, it is human generational time which is the benchmark for presenting these royal genealogies. I am not saying that all these genealogies were true. At times they were fictitious and manufactured. Nevertheless, at the level of consciousness, it was very much worldly, and it was very much in the politics of the mundane life that all these fudgings also had been done. So, this charge at least would not have been valid had they had access to Puranic sources. But the Pandits probably felt that Puranas talked highly of the kings and the Kshatriyas, and that could have diminished the importance and value of the Brahmins, the priestly class, in the eyes of the British administrative people, and therefore they probably prescribed texts which talked of the virtues of Brahmins, and which talked of Brahmanical order of things, and where probably Kshatriyas are held as maybe junior partners in this exercise of ruling and so forth. Now, having said this, we do get to understand as to why they were very selective in their approach. Why is it that they are only talking of the Vedas? Why it is that they are only talking of the Upanishads and Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras and so forth? So, that is one thing. Apart from that, of course, we know that there were several other sources, for instance, archaeological sources and inscriptions, etc., which were not probably sufficiently utilized in understanding India's past at around that point of time. But of course, we cannot be anachronistic here, and we can't expect that whatever we know about India's past is something which should have been available to the British colonial rulers in 19th century. But at the second level, what we find is that the British rule in India justified it or sought ideological justification on account of the fact that ancient Indians probably did not have it in them what it requires to rule over such a vast territory under one administrative machinery, and in the absence of that there is no development, there is no change, there is no progress. And hence it was in the interest of the Indians to have the British ruling over us, so that they could trigger change, they could bring about development, and hence the sense of history. And so, here we find a very interesting phenomena at work, and that is that this particular visualization, this particular narrative about ancient India as being bereft of historical consciousness fits in well with their ideological justification that they were seeking to project over the native people. And hence, when they said that, look, we have read all these ancient Indian sources and scriptures, but we did not find any reference to specific dates, chronology and so forth. Probably they were existing in a state of reality which was not very mindful of changes, and which was not perhaps undergoing changes and development and so forth. So, it was a static kind of society, and of course, we know that if our yesterday is same as that of today, and we don't have any sense of change, we don't detect any sense of change, then of course we would not care to note it down that why yesterday should have been a different thing from today. So that sense of history is relegated to background in the absence of any change. So this was the logic with which probably they were trying to argue home this point. And having understood the context, the colonial context, and also the factors or the limited access to the sources that they had. So this particular charge of the absence of historical consciousness in ancient India is born of these circumstances and these intentions. Subsequent to it, when over a period of time India did undergo the struggle for independence, and subsequently we acquired independence, of course there were several writings which tended to question this presumption or this particular charge made against ancient Indians that they did not have historical consciousness. And several works noticeably of Romila Thapar and several others do tell us that there were several other sources which could have been looked at, or the sources that we have available today. Had they read these inscriptions, say Ashokan inscriptions, then probably they could have got a better sense of ancient India in terms of historical consciousness. Had they read the Junagarh inscription of Rudradaman, perhaps again they could have had a solid evidence where a king is engaging with something very mundane and is mindful of changes which have happened over a period of several centuries or even before that. So they were probably not looked at, and of course the entire genre of literature beyond the limited set of books and scriptures that we spoke of, had they had a good look at these sources, say Puranas, or for that matter even Jatak stories or other Jain accounts, probably they could have had a sense of how ancient Indians cared to engage with the mundane in their own symbologies, in their own, it had a grammar of its own. So the metaphors are different, and this is something which is very culture specific. And these things appear very common to us today, but probably in the 19th century and early part of 20th century, such sophisticated understanding or such cultural sensitivity perhaps was missing around that time. And of course, it was all embroiled in the politics, the colonial politics, which of course was a dominant concern beneath such charges. So what we have now is one is the look at a variety of sources which negate this particular charge that ancient Indians did not talk about time, or time was not reckoned as human time in these sources. Second, at the theoretical level, we have another set of argument which is also very pertinent here, and that is that it is quite possible that these sources that the British administrative historians read operated, or accounts in these sources were presented with a notion of time which is not linear, as was the case with the European civilizational context, where the Christian conceptualization of time is linear in nature. When I say linear, what we mean is that all events are time and space specific, and they are unique events in the sense that if they have happened at some point of time in history, it moves on and then we have another set of or another event which will not be duplication or replication of the same event which has happened earlier. Why? Because time is always moving and time is always changing, and if the time dimension changes, then of course the uniqueness of the new event would also be maintained, or it would also be changing, because space can be the same, even human agencies can be the same, but time factor is changing. So, no event is replication of the earlier event, and all events are unique events, and it is in a particular direction that we see the time moving. This is the Christian conceptualization of time with which the British administrative historians were operating, and they found that in ancient India probably this conceptualization of time was not there. But what is important for us to understand is that there is also a very dominant understanding of time with which ancient Indians were operating, and that is the cyclical notion of time. When we say cyclic notion of time, what we mean is the conceptualizations like the 4 yugas. So, we have Satyug, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga and Kali Yuga, and again the Kali Yuga will give way to Satyug. So, this is how at the level of abstraction, at the level of popular consciousness probably, ancient Indians were operating, and since things were destined to come back to the same point, therefore, some kind at the level of logic one can say this, that the uniqueness of an event or uniqueness of a mundane event is sometimes lost sight of, and it is not maybe considered worthy to be mentioned, because it is likely to recur, because time is cyclic and it will again come back to the same thing, and hence there was probably no need to mention them as unique events, and that's how or that could have been a contributory factor in somewhat this relative absence of engagement with the mundane that we witness in the sources that the British colonial historians had access to in the Vedas, Upanishads, Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras and so forth. So, specific names of people, places, specific time, etc. are not mentioned, and what is mentioned actually is huge categories of cosmic time ranging in say thousands of years, which of course for chronology bound sequence of events in human terms becomes somewhat not useful, because if you talk of an event whose time context extends into several thousands of years, into yugas, then it's difficult to fathom the worldly aspect or the mundane aspect, the real aspect of these events. But what is of importance is for us to understand today is that maybe that ancient Indians, since they were operating with a different conceptualization of time altogether, they were writing like this. It was not with a sense of some kind of a disrespect to everyday life, or it's not as if all Indians in ancient times were otherworldly oriented, so to say. Now, having spoken about the cyclic and linear notion of time, let's now come and have some kind of a survey of what other sources were informing about ancient India's concern with the mundane. And here we find that say Ashoka's inscriptions. Now, all of us do know that inscriptions make entry into Indian history from the Mauryan times and precisely from the Ashokan period in the form of Ashokan edicts, Ashokan inscriptions. In one of the Ashokan inscriptions, we do find very specifically that Ashok mentions the particular regnal year in which he carried out something. We are told of the Kalinga War in 12th or 13th year of Ashoka's rule through an inscription. And when you speak of time as precise as 12th or 13th year of your reign, of course, you are very much mindful of what yearly duration is all about, and you are not operating with time categories which are geological time or cosmic times. These are very real human times that here Ashok is talking of, but probably it escaped the notice of the colonial historians, or maybe deliberately they did not invoke such instances in making this kind of an impression about India's past. Similarly, if we see Rudradaman's inscription or if we see Junagadh inscription, there also we find that the ruler speaks of the upkeep and maintenance and repair of Sudarshan Tadag, which is a lake. And what is interesting is that in the same inscription, some kind of reference is made about earlier set of people or set of officials who at the behest of other kings in past had also carried out the repair of that particular lake, Sudarshan Lake. And that gives us this impression that it is spoken of that even during the Mauryan period, this particular governor had got this tadag made, or it was repaired and so forth. Therefore, again here we find something very specifically historical which is identifiable in terms of other evidence. So, it is in very concrete mundane terms that these references or these instances are alluded to in these inscriptions, and had they probably read these inscriptions again, it could have cut into the kind of charge that they were making against ancient India. Or the historical consciousness being absent from ancient India. Similarly, we have already alluded to the Puranic literature, which is again full of royal genealogies. And not all these royal genealogies are true and very descriptive in nature, in the sense that quite a few fictitious genealogies were also made, and not all genealogies were constructed genealogies. At times these genealogies carried parts of concoction also, because of some kind of a charm of associating their lineage, their ruling lineage, to some iconic sources of power, even in mythological terms. So, every dynasty would like the royal lineage to be somehow linked to, say, the Suryavanshis or the Chandravanshis, and that may not always, that might not always have been true in a concrete historical sense, but it does point towards some kind of a concern with the past, which is very real. You tend to concoct, you tend to present past in a different way only when you realize that that particular past or that narrativization of past is relevant for you, or it will help you, or it is working against you in its absence. So, it is a very pragmatic engagement with past that we can see in these fudging of names also, in these concoctions also. And seen from that point of view, it has been argued by several scholars that this particular instance where kings are presenting their genealogies as having been linked to Suryavanshis and Chandravanshis is on account of some kind of a historical compulsion, and that is that they wanted to legitimize their rule. And as per the Indian tradition, we are given to understand that at the prescriptive level at least, the Kshatriyas were supposed to be the kings, and if a non-Kshatriya becomes a king on account of real historical factors, then over a period of time, in order to seek ideological legitimacy, they would rather try to present their genealogies in such a way which is very much in sync with the tradition, with the custom, and therefore some kind of an unease, a sense of unease that probably existed with them, that was sought to be removed, and this sense of conformity to the tradition was sought, and therefore they betrayed this kind of an urge to link their genealogy with the Kshatriya lineage, iconic Kshatriya lineage. Maybe that it carried some kind of an impact at the notional level amongst people, and it helped them acquiring legitimacy for the perpetuation of their rule. So, when history is so what we find in this instance is that there is some kind of a functional usage to which past is being put to, and this takes us to another way in which history could have been visualized in ancient India. For instance, in several of the texts from ancient India, we find that there are several couplets written, and then towards the end of a particular couplet we find the word iti, and it is the root word for the Hindi word for history, and that is itihas. And what does this mean actually in literal sense? Iti in Sanskrit would mean thus it happened, or it happened thus. So, it tells us whatever is being said in these in those lines summed up as iti, it is actually a narrativization of past. It might not be descriptively very true, but if one looks at the intent behind it, one finds that in some way or the other, one account of past is sought to be presented, and invariably we find that those accounts of past somehow were presented in ways which justified the existing rule at that point of time. So, there is this kind of an instrumental usage of past that we get to see in the writings of these ancient writers, and this is how they are present in the scriptures and other Brahmanical sources. Now, again this takes us to the point that it is quite possible for several cultures or different cultures to have their own conceptualization of time. It could be cyclic, it could be linear. For instance, farmers' notion of time is different. They minute by minute or second by second account might not be of much usage to them. Rather, it is the season change, or it is the change with respect to seasons which are more important to them, because their livelihood is dependent on rains and weather conditions, hot or cold or so forth, which are working as some kind of variables in their scheme of things. So, they would rather not care about diurnal changes or yearly changes, rather they would reckon with seasonal units for their consciousness. And that is similarly, there are studies which point to the fact that even in Europe we had churches' notion of time which are different from farmers' notion of time, and farmers' notion of time are different from industrial workers' notion of time, where hourly kind of reckoning became important because wages were calculated on that basis, diurnal wages were calculated on the basis of hour of works and so forth. And as we find that if one has to talk about geological aspects, geological changes, if one has to talk about astronomical phenomena, of course, the reckoning of time does not follow yearly pattern or minute or second pattern. There is a huge chunk of time that we are using in geological or astronomical sense and so forth, and therefore their units are different. So, geological time is different from astronomical times are different from farmers' times are different from churches' times are different from industrial workers' time and so forth. So, the reckoning that a present day athlete would do is again very precise, because one has to measure the microseconds also. So, what we are trying to say here is that it is the occupational context, it is the cultural context which will influence as to what becomes the dominant conceptualization of time, and probably it is on account of the cyclic understanding of time, and the resultant fact that unique events are not that important in terms of getting them recorded and so forth, that we find this kind of absence from these sources so far as specific dates and chronological accounts are concerned. Now, this is at the back of this particular debate amongst the colonial and Indian historians, who have been trying to put across this point of view that maybe that ancient Indians operated with a different notion of time, but it is not always true to hold that they did not have historical consciousness altogether. Maybe that linearity of change might be missing from these accounts, but that is precisely on account of their conceptualization of time, their visualization of time as cyclic. Also, it is said that the way ancient accounts present things, there are quite a few skills that one should have in order to decode these texts. For example, there are instances where time, or the sense of time, or the sense of change, sense of human change is very much embedded and in these accounts, and there are instances where it is very much externalized. So, for instance, the Ashokan inscription example, or the Junagadh inscription account, etc., that we talked of are actually externalized form of historical consciousness, because they explicitly mention it. But the Puranic account, where dates might not be matching, where dates might not be very real, nevertheless embedded in them, embedded in these narratives or embedded in these genealogies are a kind of conceptualization which are very much historical, because it reckons with change and it also reckons with the need to justify the present. And therefore, it is said that maybe that during those times history was understood as a means to justify the present, and that is how history was conceived, history was visualized. So, history is the mechanism by which the present can be accorded some kind of legitimacy by using instances from past. Those instances might not be always real in the sense of having actually happened, but they could have been real in the sense that it captured people's minds. So, if you have a story where something is shared as part of a common understanding or some kind of a common belief, even that could be utilized in order to justify the present, and therefore, at least the sense of history was not missing. Of course, it was not following the pattern of recording the way Europe was doing it in the late 18th and 19th century, because by this time, post the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and also the positivist philosophy, which was the triumphant philosophy in the 19th century Europe, they had come to present history as a chronology bound, factual, verifiable kind of history, operating with historical facts and so forth. But even this was new to Christian tradition, because if one has to look at the biblical account of the origin of earth and origin of human beings, we do find that it is presented as not more than 4,000 years old. Of course, it was not very precise, calibrated, chronologically documented kind of history that Europeans are talking of. They are talking of what probably existed as commonsensical knowledge, or what probably existed as some kind of a religiously religiously ordained kind of fact or truth. So, they are just subscribing to a common view and without actually testing its historical verifiability or actual historical content and so forth. So, what we find is that in the pre-modern times, different societies had this kind of conceptualization of history, which was different from the kind of history which had come into being in the course of 19th century on account of several changes around the society in which they were living, the intellectual currents like positivism that we spoke of and so forth. And in history, if we use the same yardstick to assess and understand all historical accounts from different cultures and from different periods, then probably we are not being culturally sensitive. So, it is at the cost of cultural insensitivity that one would fall into the trap of making such judgmental remarks about India's past, in the sense of saying that ancient Indians did not have historical consciousness. So, these are the ways through which one can actually look at this particular issue of the presence or absence of historical consciousness. What we have done is we first tried to look at the actual charge which is and we also looked at the segment from where this charge is being made. We looked at the circumstances. We looked at the limited number of documents, limited number of texts which were read, and hence the impression that was made after reading those accounts. We also saw that the cultural context in which these texts were produced. We also saw that the notions of time with which these texts were produced perhaps was not taken into account, and it was by abandoning that notion of time that these judgments are being made about ancient India. So, the cyclic notion of time, which is the backdrop, which constitutes the context in which things are getting written in these accounts, that is completely lost sight of, and one is being very much Eurocentric in applying the criteria of linearity and the criteria of chronology in assessing India's past and in assessing the presence or absence of historical consciousness as such. Then we also talked of the methodological issues where a number of sources were simply not looked at. So, archaeology was not reckoned with, and the inscriptional references are completely lost sight of in making such a judgment. Then when we move on to the other context where these assertions are being contested by Indian historians, we do encounter several ways and means through which this kind of conceptualization can be refuted. And we also saw the politics, the real politic of the colonial rule, where this kind of presentation or this kind of narrative about India's past actually became a tool by which the British could perpetuate the colonial rule. So, by projecting India's past as changeless, by projecting that ancient Indians just did not have historical consciousness as such, it was sought to be projected that so far Indian history had been devoid of any progress and change, and it is only at the behest of British intervention, European intervention, that these changes could be made or these changes can be made, and hence it would be in the interest of the native Indians to allow the British rulers to rule over them, because they would be the harbingers of change and development with which Indian history had no association. And we also saw how this kind of faulty understanding of India's past is reflected in theories like Asiatic mode of production and Oriental despotism, where the cornerstone of these theories is changeless India, and hence the unhistorical India, ahistorical India. We also saw that it is not only about ancient India as such. We also saw the limitations of Christian ancient sources, where chronology or exactitude with reference to time and place is completely lost sight of, or is a very faulty presentation. Yet one does not make such charges against those texts, because it is in the colonial context that these charges are being made. Therefore, there is nothing absolute in character which is visible in these charges. It is always with reference to the politics and context of the times that we are talking of that we should be we should be assessing these labels and charges. Therefore, what as some kind of a conclusion, we would say that today in the 21st century, when we have come to have a very sophisticated understanding of history and historical consciousness, one should always be culturally sensitive to the kind of histories that a society comes to have, or a society comes to project for itself, because at every point of time in history and at different places and different communities might be operating with different conceptualization of time altogether. And if we are completely unmindful of these conceptualizations, then perhaps we would be making error in our judgments about their historicity, or their historical consciousness, or their history sense. And that is precisely what it seems to have happened in the case of British administrative historians, who towards the beginning of 20th century started making started labeling these charges against ancient India, and hence this particular label that ancient India was completely devoid of historical consciousness, which we have seen through the lecture, that it stands discredited today in the light of theoretical sophistication, in light of several evidence to the contrary, and also in terms of cultural sensitivity. So, it is through the Eurocentric understanding that one made this kind of a charge.
Sir, thank you so much for that lecture of ours on the historical consciousness in ancient India, and I am sure that the students would be able to shape a different perspective on this very idea and also gain a different insight through what sir had to say. So friends, with the little time left, we bring our lecture to a close by thanking sir. Thank you so much, sir, for being associated with us, and thank you friends for watching. Have a great day.